British government. Both the state of Israel and Britain have a policy, the United States has a very similar one, where after 50 years, documents that were marked as secret by the government, unavailable to the public, are declassified and made available to people. And so after 30 years, and then again, the most sensitive of those documents are released again after 50 years. So in 1978, that first batch of documents is released, and Israeli historians start to do their work on those documents. So it's only in the 80s and then mostly in the 90s that we start to see work coming out from the release of those documents. Ilan Pappé in the late 1970s is doing his PhD, and he gets a hold of many of these new documents and dramatically changes the standard narrative that was produced on the history of Palestine and Israel. I say all of this now because Ilan Pappé is my main source for this lecture. And it's important to note, a lot of people will give this lecture, the history of Palestine, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. A lot of people have written books, numerous books, and try to take a dispassionate, academic, objective stance on this issue. And what that usually translates to is that we're only using sources from pre-1978. Pre-1978, the available sources were the express narratives of the Israeli government and any other, particularly Western governments, that were supporting that standard narrative. And so that's seen as the least subjective way of approaching this topic, is to use the standard narratives. But of course, you're taking the main narrative there from the Israeli government, the perpetrator of, or at least a participant in this whole conflict. Okay? So I say all this just to say that if you want that objective, or as objective as any presentation can be, view, you have to start to look at the works that are being produced based on documents that come out after 1978. And what, across the board, these new historians, who I've listed the most famous of them here, across the board, what they determined was that the new release of documentation confirmed the oral history narrative that Palestinians had been saying all along. But because that oral history was being passed down through family members, it was viewed as very subjective, it wasn't viewed as an academic take, the new historians came in, they gave that academic legitimacy to that history that had already been being told for generations at that point. And were able to bring that into the world of academic history and sociology and geography. So there's a context that's needed before we jump into this history. That context is the main idea that Dominane was pushing when he said that in order to achieve a peaceful world, we need to separate out populations. The argument that he's pushing there is what we call nationalism. What we call nationalism is the ideology that was being described in his work there, and that gets taken up by Western powers and dominates our world politics today, so much so that we've reached a point where what we call the nation state is just synonymous, if you look at this first definition on the top there, it's just synonymous with country in the world today, even though it's a particular form of country. If you go back in history, anything before maybe the mid-1800s can't be called a nation state. It wasn't a form of governance that existed in the world at that time. Nationalism is this idea that we can divide the human population of the world up into distinct groups based on vague attributes, but things that we would identify as language or religious practices or ethnic backgrounds. Somehow you're going to form something called a nation, and then each of those nations is supposed to have a state that represents them, where they live, where they are best suited to live, and that if every nation gets its own state, we'll get this jigsaw puzzle world where everybody fits together and it all balances out. That's the dominant ideology of our political world, our modern world order today. It's crucial to the discussion of Palestine because the standard narrative of the history of Palestine usually begins like this. We say Jews lived in Europe for hundreds of years. And throughout that time period, anti-Semitism was a consistent feature of the societies that they were minorities in. And every so often throughout that history, that anti-Semitism would flare up in pogroms and in attacks against Jewish society. And by the mid-1900s, it had become clear to the leadership of the Jewish populations in Europe that they could not safely continue to live in those societies, and they had to leave. And they chose to go back to their native homeland, to go back to the Middle East, to go back to that place in the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, to resettle there, and to establish for themselves a state that would represent them and that would protect them against the future of these oppressive actions that they were undergoing in Western Europe. That's the standard narrative, and that's how we usually set up our discussion of the history of modern Palestine. There's a problem with that narrative. Most of it is true. The problem with that narrative is there's a logical leap somewhere in that story. It's true that there is rampant anti-Semitism in Europe, and it's true that the inclination of any oppressed population in the world is eventually going to be to pack up and to move from the society that is consistently oppressing you to a place where you are going to be safe. The logical leap occurs when they say that we have to move to a place of safety and then build for ourselves a state that's going to protect us in that place that we just migrated to. Because we've seen, we live in America, numerous populations, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people have migrated to this country following the idea that they were oppressed in another place and they wanted to find a society where they would be free to live as themselves and where they would be safe. And of all of those hundreds of thousands of people, of all of those numerous populations that have made that move to America, none of them upon arriving here have said, now we have to establish a state. Essentially, if you're an oppressed population, you have two options. You build a state that's going to protect you in the place where you are being oppressed, or you move to a state that isn't going to protect you, that isn't going to oppress you. You don't do both. That's the logical leap that's occurring in this story. There was actually one population that did attempt to create a new state once they came to America. And of course, I'm talking about coming to America after the formation of the United States. The one population that did attempt to create a new state in America were the Zionists. The European Zionists in the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, did petition the US government to give them the newly conquered territories of New Mexico to be their Jewish state. And of course, the United States government flatly refused to allow that to happen. And it's at that point that they shift their sights to territory in the Middle East. But that doesn't happen in history. So there's a logical leap there. That logical leap is nationalism. It's buying into that idea that we need to have for ourselves our own state, and that that's the only way that the world can be safe. We have to violently, because this unmixing that we're talking about, even though Dominane describes it as scientific, it's very violent. People have to be taken out of their homes, armies have to be brought up, and people have to be force-marched across territories into places that they're unfamiliar with, and then just compelled to start a new life in a totally different part of the world. It's necessarily violent, and it's actually part of the definition of genocide, even if you're not wiping people out. Forced marches, as the Native American history in America can tell us, it's actually part of that whole concept. Before the coming of the nation state, the world didn't operate in that way. States were ruled by elite minorities. That elite minority never felt, never expressed that the entire population had to look like them, had to act like them, or speak like them, or be part of their population. They were content, and we may view this as a kind of oppression in history in our current era, but they were content to have a minority of people rule over a majority, and for that majority to be as diverse as it wants to be because it doesn't affect the makeup of the people in power. Those are the multi-ethnic empires that dominate most of our world history. If you look specifically in the Middle East, you get one of the most impressive displays of diversity in the world. If you just look at Syria, what we call Greater Syria, the part of the Ottoman Empire that covers the modern day countries of Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan, you had Arab populations, you had Jewish populations, you had Turks and Circassians and Syriacs and Assyrians and all sorts of other populations living together for thousands of years over that course of time. The nation state then gets imported to the Middle East. When does this happen? This happens with the coming of World War II to the modern Middle East. I think you can go to the next slide there. So here's a timeline that I put together on the history of Palestine. Basically, we begin a modern discussion, or a discussion of a modern Palestine with the late Ottoman era. World War I comes in and will dramatically change the nature of this place and the rest of the Middle East. And then you'll have the Mandate era up until 1947. At that point, the 1947 war occurs, the State of Israel is officially declared, and you have what Palestinians have labeled the Nakba, or the catastrophe, an expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from the territory of the new Israeli state. At that point, we go into the next era. So here we have 5 eras and 4 turning points that we're going to look at. The next era is the partition era, basically everything going up until 1967, at which point you get the 6-Day War, when Israel will conquer the remaining territories of what we call Israel today, or the State of Israel. Basically the West Bank and Gaza. They'll actually go into and take over the Sinai as well, and that'll get reversed. In 1973, the Egyptians will take Sinai back, giving us the borders that we're used to seeing today. At that point, from 1967 on, we have the development of an apartheid system in Israel. You can make an argument that there's an apartheid system in the pre-1967 Israel that exists, but it becomes undeniable once Israel conquers and occupies the territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And that will continue on, which is what that bar at the top shows. That apartheid system continues on until the present day. Within that period of time, we'll break this down into a couple more eras. The era of statehood negotiations between various Palestinian actors in the State of Israel, and then the era that we are currently in, or possibly just coming out of and maybe moving into a new era, the era of the siege of Gaza and increased settlement activity in the West Bank. We can go to the next slide there. So, the Ottoman Empire era and British Mandate. Everything changes in World War I. World War I begins 1914, ends 1919. At this time, Britain's main goal in the Middle East, in fact, Britain's main goal across all of World War I, is to secure a particular natural resource for the development of their military. World War I really kicks off because there's an arms race going on between the British Empire and the German Empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And most of that has to do with Navy. There's this understanding that whoever has the best Navy in the world is going to have global control. And Britain decides to get a leg up by making its Navy an oil-based Navy, turning all of its ships from coal fuel to oil fuel. But they need oil. They don't have any oil in the United Kingdom. And they establish a deal with the Shah of Iran to start accessing oil fields in Iran and parts of modern-day Iraq, and to start using that for Britain. At that point, there's a company that's established between the British government and the Iranian Shah. At the time, it's called the Anglo-Persian, or the Persian-Anglo oil company. Today, we call it British Petroleum. It's been around since that time, still functioning in the world today. So Britain's main goal is to make sure that they secure long-term access to those oil fields in Iran. At the time, oil had not yet been discovered in the Arabian Peninsula in Saudi Arabia, so those are the best oil fields available to them. The problem is the Ottomans controlled all of greater Syria, and so the only way that the British can get access to Iran would be to the Iranian oil would be to go all the way over to the Persian Gulf. And if they weren't able to maintain control of the Suez, which you could lose control over really easily, being a narrow strip of water going from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, then that's a very long journey all the way around Africa, as people are discovering again today. And so they wanted those territories. So there was a plan from the beginning of World War II. If we win this, being the British, we're going to make sure that we secure those territories going basically from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean, so modern-day Iraq and Jordan and Palestine. And they ultimately achieved that. We can go to the next slide here. This is the infamous Sykes-Picot map. It was a secret agreement that the British had with the French, in which they determined that the blue areas here, those A areas, are going to go to the French, so Syria and parts of modern-day Turkey. And then the red and B areas here are going to go to the British, which you can see effectively connects, this is modern-day Iraq, the deep red area. And then Iran is just here, so now they have a connection to those Iranian oil fields. And then if you ever look at a map, a modern-day map, you'll see that Jordan has this very bizarre part of the country that just kind of sticks out into the desert. It's deep, dead Syrian desert. It's considered one of the most inhospitable deserts in the world. Why Jordan wanted to draw this part of its territory that necessarily sticks out into this part of the desert, it kind of looks like they really wanted to grab something. What it was the British wanted to make sure that there was a connection between Iraq and Jordan. And at the time, of course, they weren't calling it Jordan. They were calling it Mandatory Palestine. All of the territory of Greater Israel, Palestine today, and Jordan was one territory at the time called Palestine. And then eventually after the war, they divided it into two, and they gave Jordan as a consolation prize to some of the Arabs they had pretty significantly betrayed with the creation of this map. That's another history, but essentially by the end of the war, this is the territory that Britain ends up in control of. We can go to the next slide. The other significant moment that occurs during the war is the release of the Balfour Declaration. November 2nd, 1917, Arthur Balfour, the Foreign Secretary of the British Empire, makes a declaration that the British Empire, we can actually read it, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. It's a single sentence, but has significant impact on the world. As to why the British at this point decide to back the Zionist movement, there's a lot of discussion. The main argument is that Jews already had a pretty strong lobby presence, not the official Israeli lobby that we know today, but that there was a strong Jewish community both in Russia and in the United States. The British wanted to make sure that they kept pressure up on their countries to keep them in the war, because in 1917 it wasn't going so well for them, and they needed the help of those populations. So these two documents form the foundation of British support for the creation of Palestine before World War II, and then they kick into effect immediately afterward in 1919, 105 years ago. Today, that part of the world starts to change dramatically when the British take over that territory. And then they begin to import this idea of nationalism. It's a European idea, European view of how governance is supposed to happen in the world, how the world is supposed to be recreated in the image of Western European states. That's when it comes to the Middle East most significantly. That comes in the form of the mandate system. In the immediate aftermath of World War I may have said World War II recently. Everything I meant to say is World War I at this point. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the German and Turkish empires have been dissolved. They've been taken over by Western European powers, namely Russia, France, and Britain, with a little bit of involvement from America. And there's a lot of discussion as to what is going to happen with those newly liberated territories from these former empires. There's a whole other discussion about whether or not they had to destroy those empires, and the conclusion is they did not have to. The British wanted to. They took it a step further in order to make sure that they can get hold of those territories. The mandate system is set up by the League of Nations. It becomes official in 1920, the San Remo Conference. And what it is the precursor to the United Nations. It's Western European countries coming together and saying that we need to create a system whereby advanced, and this is the rhetoric that they actually use here, that advanced nations in the West are going to coach these backward nations. Remember, nations here means groups of people. It doesn't necessarily mean a country. That we want to advance these backward Eastern nations. We want to coach them with our help to get them to a point where they're capable of running a country on their own. And it's essentially a new form of colonization, right? A much more pedantic and in their time, enlightened form of colonization. And so the mandate for Palestine is created, and it's officially given to Britain in the San Remo Conference in 1920. At this point, it's really important to be aware. Yes, there was a place in the Ottoman Empire and the various empires that came before it in that part of the world that has been called Palestine for thousands of years. But there was no nation-state idea operating in that part of the world at all. So when the British come in, and the Zionists are already operating, they're coming out of Western Europe, they have that nation-state mentality. So when they start coming in, they have an idea, we want to build a nation-state in this place. And the whole point of the mandate system is for Britain to coach a nation-state into being in this place. But the Arabs and the former subjects of the Ottoman Empire have no such concept of a nation-state. It's not that they're not able to understand it and learn from it, but it's not how their world operated at all. It's a bizarre idea to these people to go in and tell them that you have to drive out all of these other populations that live in your area in order to secure for yourself a state that's going to take care of you. They would say, we had a state that took great care of us for 600 years, and you guys just tore it apart, and we were able to live, Muslims and Christians and Jews and Druze and all of these other populations together, so why do we need to be convinced of this argument? There isn't an idea that we are a Palestinian people that makes us different from those people just on the other side of the river. And this becomes one of the main turning points, one of the main sticking points of the era that's going to develop here under British mandate, because the British are continuously pushing for the development of a nation state. The Zionists are all on board with that concept, and they want it to be a Jewish nation state. The Arabs are divided. There's two basic factions, there are many more, but the two basic factions basically are one group saying we're going to resist this British occupation, we're going to fight against the British, and we're not going to accept that they're going to break up Greater Syria into these different countries, that we want to have a united Syria is what they were looking for at the time. That group had a publication that they called Janubiya, Surya Janubiya. They called Southern Syria. It was the main publication of that political organization. The other organization that formed were Arabs in that place who just said, no, let's go along with this British plan. We're not going to fight the British. We're going to fight it out with the Zionists to see who gets this nation state that the British are going to create here. And they have their main publication called Palestine. And that's where this becomes the dominant idea. Eventually, they'll win out because the ones that fight against the British don't have really any success in overthrowing the British system. And so it's the group of Arabs that will ultimately win out over the newly forming political class in that region. We can go to the next slide. Meanwhile, with the Zionist camp, there's a concerted effort. We are going to create a nation state. There's no debate about that. The only debate that they have is how big is it going to be? Is it going to be just that territory that's formed by the British? Is it going to include Jordan? Because that was part of Palestine right before the British decided to divide their mandate in half. But that effort is this concerted effort in order to create this nation state. These boxes here, they're called tzedakah boxes in Hebrew, sadaqa boxes in Arabic, or the little blue box is how it's commonly known in English. You can just see, based on the progression of these canisters that we have here, that it's only in the 1930s that they start to develop an idea of what that territory is that they're going to develop, because it's in 1923 that the British officially come up with the borders that we recognize today. You can go to the next slide here. All of this sets us up for 1948. And I'll just say I knew this was going to happen. I knew I was going to spend most of my time, even before the creation of the State of Israel, but we need to understand that background, and I'll go quickly here through the rest of that history. We can go to the next slide. That brings us to the Nakba, 1948. This is the most critical turning point of this entire history. In 1947, December 11th, 1947, the British announced that we are going to withdraw on May 15th of 1948. The British, by this point, have gone through World War II. They're no longer the global powerful empire that they used to be. They want to be done with managing this mandate system that Zionist and Arab populations have been fighting over. So they announced unilaterally, we're pulling out at that point in essentially 3 or 4 months. And so immediately, Arab and Jewish populations, Arab and Zionist political leaders start setting up and trying to position themselves as best as they can to take over the country as soon as that date of May 15th, 1948 rolls around. By this point, there had already been numerous clashes. In 1935, Palestinian or Arab dock workers in Haifa had uncovered a large stash of smuggled guns that were being brought in for by the JNF, by the Jewish National Fund, for the newly forming Haganah, the Zionist military that will eventually become the IDF. And it becomes very clear to the local populations at that point that there is that this Zionist group is interested in conquering this territory. And from that point on, in 1935, you have repeated clashes between these populations. It all breaks out May 15th, 1948. Again, there had been numerous clashes already happening at that point. So when historians start the clock and say who was the first one to throw the first punch, they, for some reason, decide to start in November of 1947 with an Arab attack on a Jewish bus going between Netanya and Tel Aviv. And I think 30 Jews are killed in that attack. That's the official narrative that's given. If you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, that's the first strike that's recorded in the 1948 war, in November of 1947. Even though, as I said, clashes had been going back and forth at that point for somewhere in the area of 20 years and would continue on significantly. It gets most heated and it breaks out into full-scale war in May 15th, 1948. At that time, the Arab armies of the newly created countries of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and it's important to note all these countries are at most 2 years old by this point. None of them have significant military or any military experience, and they have very disorganized militaries. They invade. In total, between the 5 countries, there's 7,000 Arab troops that enter the area of Palestine. There are 7,000 Haganah soldiers augmented by the Irgun and the Stern gangs fighting on the Jewish side. So about pretty equal parity at that point. When all of the dust settles, Jordan is in control of the West Bank. The Hashemi government in Jordan had actually made a agreement with the newly forming state of Israel that we're going to take the West Bank, we're not going to fight you any further into that territory. It's a shame because the Jordanian military, of all of the militaries involved, including the Haganah, was the best military in the region. It was basically a British created and run military. They secure the West Bank, Egypt secures Gaza, Syria secures the Golan Heights, and Israel gets the rest of the territory. All of this is premised on the United Nations, which had just been born in 1947, just the year before, coming to this resolution, famous resolution 181, that said that we're going to partition this territory between these two populations. The Jews are going to get just over 50%, and the Arabs are going to get the remainder of that state. There's another map right here. This is the partition. It's really important to note here that one of the most common narratives that we hear is that the state of Israel gets the backing that it gets from Western states because when the United Nations made its resolution to partition, they accepted it and the Arabs didn't, and so that's why the Jewish state got 50% of the land, because the Arabs weren't cooperating with the United Nations, essentially. The yellow territory is what the United Nations determined the Arabs would get, and the blue territory was supposed to be a Jewish state. That's not how this works at all. The United Nations doesn't go to people and get them to agree to their resolutions. The United Nations is a group of countries. At this point, it's like 20-some, 30-some countries. And of those 5 were Arab countries. Of those 5, only 2 were actually independent. That's Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The other 3 were British and French controlled states. They were not yet independent states. Those countries vote on these resolutions and then tell the people that they're voting about what we've decided is going to happen to you. There are 2 solutions put forward by United Nations representatives. One of them is the partition solution. It won by just over 50% of the votes. The other one that half the countries pushed for was called the democratic solution. Essentially, we create one state, we allow the Jews and the Arabs to all live there, you make it democratic, and you let them vote into being what kind of government that they want. Of course, that doesn't work for a Jewish state, because then you end up with an Arab majority, and democracy is supposed to go with that majority vote. So the partition plan worked out, the war takes place, and immediately afterward the United Nations says this was a mistake. And they say, let's go back and go with the other resolution. But at this point, things are already in play. The Zionist entities had already made a determination that as soon as we're given a green light, we're clearing out as many Arabs as we can from our Jewish territory. Because the thrust of world politics at that point is that if you want to be aligned with the Western powers, you've got to be a democracy. But if you're a democracy with a minority population and you have a majority population of Arabs, you're not going to have a Jewish state anymore. So they go as quickly as they can, and the plan is get as many Arabs out of what's going to become our Jewish state as we can before intervening powers step in. And so the Nakba, as it's called, occurs. 750,000 Palestinians are driven out of those territories and more, and the Jewish forces go in and take over even more territory, giving us the pre-1948 territories that we recognize today. We can go to the next slide. This will lead us into that partition era. From that point on, the Jewish state, the state of Israel, as it's officially declared at that point, is really just those pre-1948 territories. They have no access and control over Gaza and none over the West Bank. But throughout the 50s, that nation-state mindset, that nationalism is going to bleed into those Arab societies. And Jordan and Egypt both are going to make the decision not to annex those territories that they had military control over. Jordan originally planned, we're going to make the West Bank part of our territory, but once that nationalist rhetoric starts developing in Jordan, they realize if we make the West Bank part of Jordan, then Jordan is going to be majority Palestinian. And even more significantly, there's a lot of nationalist rhetoric developing among the Palestinians in that West Bank territory. And the Jordanian government, which is the Hashemi royal family, which has its own history of how it ended up there, but this royal family becomes very hesitant about bringing in officially that whole population of Palestinians into their country, because the other Hashemi royal family, their cousins in Iraq, just got overthrown by a nationalist revolution in that country, 1958. And they don't want to be overthrown. So they keep the West Bank territory as occupied territory, which sets us up for the era that we are in today. 1967, the IDF launches a surprise attack, takes over the rest of those territories. They take over the West Bank, Gaza, and they go all the way into the Sinai. And then they do essentially the same thing that the Jordanians had done. They determine we have to keep this now as occupied territory, because if they actually annexed it into the state of Israel, then they'd have the same problem. You'd have a majority Palestinian population. And democracy is just such a funny thing that if you bring in all those people, you're not going to have a majority Jewish state running for you anymore. By the end of the Six-Day War, which goes from June 5th to June 10th, they control a much larger territory, and in that move they expel a further 350,000 Palestinians from their homes. Of those, 125,000 were people who had been previously expelled in 1948. So they're now twice exiled communities. Most of that 125,000 end up in Gaza. So a large percentage of the population of Gaza, as it works out, is a twice exiled, and now we don't know how many times exiled population. This is the era of apartheid. This is, by definition, and without a doubt, an era of beginning apartheid in the formation of the State of Israel, because the Israeli government is now, for all intents and purposes, responsible for a population of what will work out to be in a few generations, or in a generation, about 7 million Jews, and including those occupied territories, about 7 million, just over 7 million Palestinians as it stands today. And apartheid, at its simplest definition, first of all, it's a war crime. It's officially made a war crime after the affairs of South Africa. And apartheid is the structuring of a state system to force the majority of the land and resources of that state to serve one race among multiple races that a government is ruling over. That's the basic idea. If you structure your state system so that the majority of resources are going to a particular race among the people that you have responsibility for, that is an apartheid system. People get caught up in all of the details of what South African apartheid looked like, and if you compare Israel to South Africa, then there are a few things that South Africa did that Israel isn't doing. But that isn't the only definition of apartheid that's available to us. It's not even the complete definition of apartheid. Resources and land management is how that is understood. If in the United States we said that white people get 87% of water in this country, and black people get 17%. That's not even a fair comparison, because America's 13% African American. If there was a parity between those populations, it would be better. But even if it was structured in that way, there would be immediate outrage. Right? Now, this actually happened before. This is how America functioned for a long time. But now, there would be immediate outrage. That's exactly what goes on in Palestine. Israelis have access to, there's a massive aquifer underneath the West Bank. It's the main source of fresh water in that entire territory. The Jordan River pales in comparison to the amount of fresh water that's in the West Bank aquifer. It sits right underneath where the majority of Palestinians in this territory are living. 87% of the water of that aquifer goes to Israeli citizens, who at best we're going to say are 50% of that territory. and 17% go to the Palestinians. Palestinians have strict restrictions on how deep they can drill wells, and the West Bank is mountain territory, so half the time, I forget the depth of the well, there's a certain number of meters that they're allowed to drill. It doesn't even make it to the aquifer in many of the places in the West Bank. That one fact is enough to justify the claim that apartheid is happening in this region, and like I said, this really goes from 1967 until the present day. This situation is going to slowly build until we'll have two significant events. One is political, the other is actually happening in the lives of the people in this territory. The first is Egypt will take back the Sinai with the 6th of October War in 1973, reducing Israel down to the size and the borders that are functioning today. And then the first Intifada will occur in 1987. The instigator of the first Intifada, the most proximate cause for it, is in Gaza in the Jabalia refugee camp in November 20th, I think, of 1987. There's an Israeli truck that drives into traffic. It's an accident, essentially, and it ends up killing 4 Palestinians. But that's built in with the whole backdrop of, at this point, generations and decades, a couple of decades, of severe apartheid and oppression of the Palestinian people and dramatic restrictions on their ability to grow and thrive as a people living in this territory. And so immediately afterward, there are riots that break out in Gaza, and then those riots will spread across the West Bank as well, and this will become the first Intifada. It'll last for 6 years, from 1987 until 1993. And it's in this time, 2 days into this Intifada, that Hamas will emerge as an organization operating mostly in the West Bank. The PLO had been in operation essentially since 1967. Technically, they started a little bit before, but it's kind of a false start. But the PLO had been operating mostly in the West Bank and in Gaza from 1967 on. By the time we get to 1993, the Oslo Accords occur. The State of Israel and the PLO officially recognize each other as, in the one case, a legitimate state, and in the other, a legitimate political organization. And the PLO, the State of Israel gives the PLO authority over the West Bank and Gaza as a kind of pseudo-state. They give them authority over the people of that territory, not the actual territory itself. They have internal security obligations in certain areas, and then civil service obligations for all Palestinian people. But it's important to note that as a Palestinian state, that Israel is kind of recognizing them as, they're a state for the people, not in control of any space or territory in that region. Those are the official rules of the Accords, but from this point on, Israel is going to continuously violate the Oslo Accords that they had made with the PLO. And that is going to build up, those tensions are going to build up until 2000. And in 2000, Sharon, who hopefully you know who he is, I won't go into his background, that'll take forever. Ariel Sharon, one of the famous generals and prime ministers of the State of Israel, in an act of protest against the Israeli government, because he's against the formation of the Oslo Accords and the recognition of the PLO, he takes 1,000 soldiers and storms Masjid al-Aqsa. This is in the year 2000. And when he does that, it sparks protests all across the West Bank and Gaza. And for the majority of these protests are nonviolent protests. This is going to be the second Intifada. But the Israeli government cracks down brutally on these Palestinian protests, and within the first week, 47 people are killed, and hundreds are severely injured. And so after the first week, violent resistance from the Palestinians start to emerge. After a month of this, we start to see suicide bombings. And this will become the main rhetoric of the State of Israel from that point on, that the Palestinians use suicide bombings. It's the PLO that does the majority of these suicide bombings, and then Hamas starts to pick them up as well, because it's seen as the only effective way of bringing any kind of damage to this state. And that'll go on for about 3 years. The Intifada goes on for 6 years, or 5 years, until 2005. And the suicide bombing era is really within that time period. In 2005, the PLC, which is the official legislative body of that newly created Palestinian state that went into effect in 1993. They had their first election in 96. They have their second election in 2006. At that point, that's actually the last slide. Yeah. At that point in 2006, Hamas gets a majority of the seats. There's like 132, I don't know if it says it here. There's like 132 seats. Hamas gets 74 of those seats. Essentially, the PLO, who just lost the election, says, no, we're not doing that. They're the body that's recognized by the State of Israel. So both the PLO and the IDF attack Hamas, drive them out of the West Bank. Hamas gets essentially cornered in Gaza, and a civil war between the PLO and Hamas breaks out for the next 2 years, 2006 until 2008, at which point, in that time, Sharon, who was the prime minister by that point, pulls all Israeli settlers out of Gaza, where most of the fighting is happening, pulls the Israeli military out, builds a wall around Gaza, and begins the siege of Gaza. Hamas is left in control of the internal functioning of Gaza, but Israel is in control of all of its borders. They're in control of the airspace, they're in control of the sea, and they're in control of all the resources that enter this territory. In the meantime, in the West Bank, the PLO, their government is now essentially defunct. What's called the PLC, the Palestinian Legislative Council, is the government. The PLO is a party within that government. That government goes into recess from 2006 until today, because they rejected the outcome of the vote. And the PLO just starts ruling, or to the extent that the Israelis allow them, ruling the West Bank just through presidential decrees. And very little is done at that point in terms of any kind of civil service or governmental function within the West Bank. And Hamas becomes the main internal governing force of Gaza. From this point on, two things occur consistently. Increased settlement activity in the West Bank, in direct violation of the Oslo Accords. Settlements are popping up everywhere in the West Bank throughout the time, the 20 years essentially since this transition. And with that settlement activity is a great deal of violence. But even without the bloody, violent expulsions that happen every few years, the people of the West Bank are left with essentially no governing service. There's no civil service. They get nothing from the Israeli government. They get almost nothing from the Palestinian Authority. And so even without, and this is important to emphasize, even without direct action being taken against those populations, you have an entire population that at this point, since 1967, has been functioning without any support. If you just think about all of the rules that affect us on a daily basis living in a developed modern nation state, our restrictions on economic activity, our laws against certain crimes, our health care, and all of these other laws, they live without any of that. Economic activity is just whoever can make the most money gets to make the most money, and you get this dramatic difference appear in Palestinian society in the West Bank between some people who are able to quickly garner a lot of wealth and some people who are not able to. And we don't realize how much our economic systems that are enforced by governments that we live in help to try and maintain a relatively stable situation. So just a point that even without that direct violent action by militaries, this is an extreme form of oppression. In Gaza, there's a little bit more. Hamas is able to apply a little bit more of a system, but they have almost no resources. And a deal is worked out, basically, between Hamas and the Israeli government, in which the Israeli government says, we're going to give you a certain amount of resources. We're going to allow a certain amount of resources in. We're going to allow some people to go from Gaza and work in the official state of Israel and then go back home. And over time, over a 2-year period, the Israeli government will slowly reduce the amount of aid that they get. And we end up in this 2-year cycle where that aid reduces. And then Hamas has to do something. People go and they protest the government of Hamas in Gaza. And they realize we've got to do something to get this aid rolling again. So they send rockets into Israel. And that gets the Israeli military to respond. And the Israeli military comes in and they bomb Gaza, and you get international attention, and then both Hamas and Israel are forced to come to a table and negotiate a ceasefire, and Hamas gets Israel to go back to the amount of resources that they were allowing in earlier. This happens like clockwork every 2 years, 2006, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2016, and then, or 2014, then we have the biggest jump that we have going to 2018, 2021, and 2023. This happens every single year. By 2021, the government, the Hamas government in Gaza, and of course, always have to know, Israel is the government of this territory. Israel is in control of what's happening in this territory. Hamas has a civil service obligation to the people of Gaza. By this point, the Hamas government says, we can't do this anymore. It is impossible for us to manage these people. You keep cutting off our resources, and then the people come and they protest to us, and they come and they attack us and tell us that we're the ones that are supposed to get them the resources that they need. And they finally say, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to keep going through this 2-year cycle. So Hamas officially in 2021 renounces any political obligation over Gaza. They say we're not in charge here anymore. The political wing withdraws and they stop governing. At that point, the military wing of Hamas, and Hamas has 3 wings. They have a civil service wing, a political wing, a military wing. The civil service wing is dead because they ran out of resources. The political wing withdraws in 2021. And at that point, the military wing says, all right, the rest of Hamas is gone. We're going to bring about a military solution to this problem. They're soldiers, they think like soldiers, and they want to bring about that kind of solution. And in 2021, they start planning the largest attack that they're able to do on Israel. That planning will go on until October 7th of 2023, when they launch this final attack. And the rest of what's happened over the last 8 months occurs. We can go to the next slide. One more. At this point, and this is a conservative estimate, 43,000 people have been killed in Gaza. This is Euromed. Their calculations are, they take the official Ministry of Health of Gaza numbers. Ministry of Health in Gaza, they use the most conservative possible estimate. They only mark somebody as dead if their body is brought out and identified. It has to be brought out and somebody has to come and say, this is so-and-so. They have to give a name and identify who that person is. That's how the Ministry of Health counts the dead in Gaza. Euromed counts that, takes that number, and then they add an arbitrary 10,000. Because the most conservative estimates of the number of missing people or unidentified people is 10,000. The dramatically most conservative numbers. And they don't increase that number as the war goes on, which the number of missing people and unidentified people is necessarily increasing. They just keep it at 10,000. So even though this is more than the health ministry says, it is still a very conservative number. Currently it's at 40,000, somewhere in the area of 10,000 of those are women, 15,000 of those, or 16,000 are children. That's the current situation of Gaza as it stands today. In the West Bank, the current situation is, as I described earlier, rampant settlement activity, dramatically increasing land grabs by the Israeli government. Part of that is that politics that we talked about earlier. When Jordan decided not to annex that territory, legally the way that that works out is that the Jordanian royal family owned all of the West Bank, or in large areas, especially urban areas, they owned the land and they rented it to people. And they give them various loans. It's usually like 49 to 99 year loans, or leases. And so what happened a couple of years ago in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem was that those people's leases with the Jordanian government ran out. And so the Israelis were able to go in and say, you no longer technically have access to this land, so we're just going to drive you out and take it from you by force. It's still brutal, it's still terrible, but understanding the history helps in understanding the mechanisms of how this oppression happens. One more slide here that we'll end with. This is a very famous image in Palestinian culture. It's a little boy named Hamdallah. It was created by a Palestinian artist in 1968 named Naji al-Ali. Naji al-Ali says that when he created this image, the point was to say that Hamdallah is a 10-year-old boy. He was born in 1938. He was 10 years old in 1948 when he was driven out of his home. And he stays 10 years old. He gets trapped in that moment, the moment that Palestinians lose all freedom and enter this experience of dramatic generational oppression. So he's trapped as a 10-year-old boy. And his back is turned because he rejects the world that rejected him. And he rejects all the politics, all the various solutions that were brought up, even the Palestinian solutions that emerge. When the communist Palestinian parties emerged after 1948 and wanted to create a Marxist state for Palestine, whether that would have been a good thing or not, they ultimately all fall apart and fail. When the PLO emerges as a secular nationalist state, trying to replicate what the Zionists, secular nationalists, did for Israel, that ultimately also falls apart. And the Palestinian people feel a strong sense of betrayal. Even Hamas, there's a lot of support for them today because of the drama of the situation, because of the danger and the violence that's occurring right now. But even then, an Islamist nationalist organization that emerges is not able to bring about a solution to the suffering that these people are going through. And so attempt after attempt, by people in Palestine, by people outside of Palestine, there's a strong sense that none of it is really meant to bring about a healthy and enduring life for these people. So Hamdallah turns his back. He says, I'm not getting involved with any of this. I'm not going to continually argue with every state outside of Palestine, with every power. I'm not going to continually choose between one group of Palestinians and another group of Palestinians, and all of these dreams and all of these promises. It's been going on for 100 years. The world rejected him, so he turns around and he rejects the world. I think this is the best representation of the experience of Palestinian people. That lack of certainty of where we're supposed to turn to. We've tried everything that can be done. You tried being leftist, you tried being Islamic, you tried being democratic, you tried all of these different solutions. And people say that the Israeli government has tried to work with these people and they've tried to negotiate, and the Arabs just keep rejecting these negotiations. Even now we see the ICC releases these arrest warrants for both Israeli officials and Hamas officials. The Hamas officials say, we accept it. We'll go to court. Take us to court and let us make our case and do what you will. What we see is really the opposite. The Palestinian people have tried everything. And the people who support Palestine have tried everything But on the other side, there's one consistent program that keeps happening. That's where there's an inability to change. That's where there's an inability to negotiate, to try and find a lasting solution, to the detriment of their own people. Israelis are leaving Israel now in the droves. It's got to be a terrifying place to live. And I don't say that to say that there's any kind of parity between the terror that Palestinians go through and the terror that Israelis go through. But imagine being an Israeli citizen today and knowing that Israel is drawing all of this attention from all of these other countries, that there are missiles being fired at your country. Even if you're stopping most of them, are you always going to be able to stop them? If you're a kid graduating high school, going to college in America, you have no concerns that the country might burn down by the time you finish your degree. But among Israelis, that can't be the case anymore. So even to the detriment of their own people, they've stuck with this plan. We're going to drive these people out. At some point, that's their goal. And we'll see what solutions come. In the end, that 10-year-old boy is fixed in time. Eventually, he's going to turn around. That was Ali Naji's goal in creating him, was to say that when Palestine is free, he'll start aging again. He'll start going back about his life. He won't be trapped in this limbo anymore. That's a hope that we have. How we get there, I know it's depressing, but I believe in leaving an audience depressed in this kind of discussion. I don't want you to walk away thinking, okay, there was some kind of catharsis there. I want you to walk away feeling heavy, broken, so that you work at fixing that. And maybe one day we'll see the time when Alhamdulillah gets to turn around. Thank you all so much. I know I've gone dramatically over my time here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right, guys. Thank you again for coming. I don't know what's going on with this mic, so I'm just going to project my voice and hope for the best. We have about room for maybe one, two, I'm going to say one question. We have to be out of here at a certain time. So let's, a show of hands, I'll pass the mic to you and you can ask it.
I just wanted to ask a question that, hello, thank you, it was very informative. I am Palestinian and American, and I do want, we're active and we're trying to bring awareness. Trying to bring awareness about the Palestinian cause and issue. And so one question we keep hearing, and I see a lot of comments even on videos and stuff, and I would like to get your feedback on how do we answer that. And the question is, there was never a Palestine. And so, because there was never a Palestine, how can we say that it's Palestinian land? Thank you.
Yes, so this is a question I've been dealing with for 10 or 12 years now. My master's thesis was called No Such State as Palestine. And it gets downloaded, I get to track the downloads. It gets downloaded in Israel a ton because I think they're really hopeful for an argument in favor of Zionism. That is a fact. There was not a Palestinian state. There was a place that had been called Palestine since like 1100 BC. The name was there, but other names were there as well. Just like nationalism comes in and says you can only have one state per people or one people per state, it also comes in and says there can only be one name for a place. The old world didn't function like that. So Palestine and Judea were two terms that were used for most of this history interchangeably. That's nationalism at its best. When you say that because there wasn't a Palestinian state in this place, there can't be a Palestinian state now. Or even just saying that the only way that Palestinians can be freed is for there to be a Palestinian nation state. That is the nationalist rhetoric. But the fact of the matter is that you don't have to point to a state existing in your past to legitimize either the creation of a state or, more importantly, the existence of people in a place. No other state in the world does this. There isn't a single state in the world that can say we exist legitimately as a state because at some point in history a nation state existed, because nation states are new to this world order. And so it makes absolutely no sense. I do push that argument that as Palestinians, we need to think about what was there before, or as anybody in support of Palestinian freedom. We do need to think about and engage with that discussion of what was there before all of this, because if we don't, we're going to be stumped by that question every time. If we say that no, Palestinians are a state because we go all the way back to the Canaaniyun and they were the original, the Canaanites, and they were the original Palestinians, and that we get to live here because some original form of Palestinians lived in this place thousands of years ago, that doesn't work. That argument isn't going to work. We need to find a new way of understanding, not just in Palestine, but around the world, what makes people living in a place legitimate. And ultimately, we can sidestep that whole question and say, that's not the question that should be asked. The question that should be asked is not what makes it legitimate for you to live your life peacefully in a place. The question that should be asked is what makes it legitimate for a state with a military to come in and drive people out of a place? What makes it legitimate for you to acquire power in this place over the lives of other people, whoever you are? The whole field of history and politics and political science asks that question. Power structures have to be legitimate. People get to live where they are and don't have to justify a peaceful existence. People aren't waging war against one another. Armies and powers and governments, they wage war. They're the ones that have to legitimize themselves. So it's a question that we grapple with a lot. We really need to start arguing that no, that's not the question that should be asked. And even if it is, where else in the world is it asked? Please.
I bring that up because the danger of that argument is that if there was no state of the nation of Palestine or state of Palestine, therefore there were no Palestinians and there were only Arabs, and therefore they should go to the other Arab countries. You see where that's going?
Yeah, but the question then is, why does that make a difference? If we started calling all of those people today Judaites, if we started calling all of them Samoan in that region today, what difference does it make as to whether or not they're allowed to live in this place? The names aren't what define the right of people to occupy a space. That whole discussion has to be flipped over, and it has to be had in the other direction. What makes states legitimate in any territories? And so I really appreciate it. It's one of the most important questions that we can ask today.
I think that's a great question, and was called A Modern History of Palestine and Its Creation.
What we could do is we have an email. You can send your questions over through email, and we can always send those over to Brother Haleem, and then we can post those on our. We could do like a question and answer on our Instagram, and we can get your questions answered that way.
And as you can see, we have it posted, Lombard for Palestine. That's our Instagram. You can take a picture of it. You can follow us on Instagram. Send us questions through there. Our Gmail is Our Gmail is also the same, lombardforpalestine@gmail.com. So if you have questions, that's another way to reach us. Okay, and we'll forward those questions to. Brother Osama here. Again, thank you guys so much. I just want to say one last thing. Anything that was done well, correctly, was from Allah. Any mistakes that we made are from us, the organizers. Don't look at him. It's from us entirely, okay? So please, thank you again so much for coming. I hope it was a benefit, and please show us your support on Instagram and let us know that this was something that you guys want to see more of.